Welcome to Aging in Place Strategies and Answers with Linda Prio. Will it be possible to remain in my home as I age? Do I feel safe in my home? How do I figure out how much support I will need when my health needs start to change? What if I decide to move into a community instead? Which community will meet my needs now and in the future? Who will play a role in helping me with decision making? Do you ask yourself these same questions? Aging in Place Strategies and Answers can help you gain practical knowledge that will help you create your own Aging in Place roadmap. If you are already a care partner, a power of attorney, or in crisis mode with your Aging in Place strategy, you will learn what you need to know that you don't know. For over 20 years, I have been marketing Aging in Place services to clients and educating families and healthcare professionals in how to put aging in place strategies into place. When you utilize aging in place, you are allowed to choose where you want to live and make those decisions so that you can retain your quality of life. Welcome back to Aging in Place Strategies and Answers. I hope that you have downloaded my new podcast called One Last Request and How to Start a Conversation. Now, I'm going to be really honest with you listeners, but I have not completed this chapter in my own Aging in Place decision making because... well, I don't know. I don't know why, because I'm pretty efficient. I like to get things done. I've done some other things, but every time my husband and I sit down to review our trust on an annual basis, this is one of those things that we have not completed talking about. So today, it is going to be my pleasure to have Daniel Flynn, Managing Funeral Director for the Neptune Society, with me. And you're going to enjoy what Dan has to say because, well, you know what? I'm just going to let him say it. He can speak for himself. In fact, he's going to have the opportunity soon to be on a TED Talk, which I have to say, as a podcaster, is a pretty big deal. But Dan, say hello to my listeners. Share your favorite saying, and then give us a brief explanation of what the Neptune Society is.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me on, Linda. My favorite tagline when I'm talking to people is to say, I want you to remember that talking about sex doesn't make you pregnant, and talking about funerals doesn't make you dead.
Correct. And that's what I love when he says that. He certainly gets your attention. So now that you're all listening, tell us a little bit more about the Neptune Society.
So the Neptune Society is the oldest and largest cremation service in North America. Last year, we celebrated our 50th year in business. We have about 120 offices all across the United States and Canada. In some states, we're called different names depending on state regulations. For instance, in Virginia, we're called the Cremation Society of Virginia because that's the way it's required to be named in that state. But for the most part, we're either called either the Neptune Society or the National Cremation Service.
Perfect. So it's not a study of the moon.
Yeah.
I know that's simple and dumb, but you know what? The name does not really
I keep telling
in my head.
I keep telling the folks it doesn't really translate well to Missouri. The reason we're called the Neptune Society is we were founded in Florida, and back then their idea was when we cremate you, we will take you out on one of our boats and scatter your ashes on the high seas. Hence Neptune.
Okay.
So,
thank you for clarifying that. Now, Dan, you and I have met before, and I know that you have had a lot of experience in this space, and you really know what we need to know when we're going to be making our last requests, or we're going to be making these final decisions, or even trying to figure out how to wrap our mind around this time of life, which we know is inevitable for all of us, right? So, can you share some background about your education and then how you made cremation and funeral director part of your career field?
Okay. Well, my master's degree is in sociology, specifically in disaster studies. So I spent the beginning of my career in the disaster response business. And through just kind of an evolution of training, I suppose, I became a subject matter expert in mass fatalities. I currently serve on both the federal and Missouri state mass fatality response teams. So I get called out to things like plane crashes and hurricanes, those sorts of events. During COVID, I did 3 tours in New York and a tour in LA. You may recall during COVID at the beginning, seeing
Yes.
newscasts in New York and seeing all the rows of pine boxes.
Yes.
I was one of the people putting people in those pine boxes.
Bless you for your service. That was not easy, especially as someone who has a family member who was a police officer. We understand that those are the duties assigned and somebody does them. So thank you so much for doing that.
Not a problem.
Are you a veteran?
Yes, I am a veteran. I spent 8 years with the United States Coast Guard, which is really where my disaster response career started. You kind of get that bug of helping people at the worst time in their life, and that kind of has always stuck with me. Then I went to St. Louis University School of Pathology's death investigator program. The occupation of death investigator was actually started here in St. Louis at St. Louis University.
Incredible.
So I was trained as a death investigator, and then I moved out to California. And while I was out there, I met a woman who owned a cremation service, and she was getting ready to retire and was just going to close it down. And I said, well, I'll buy it from you. So I bought this little cremation service. I ran out and got my funeral director's license, which is much easier to do in California than it is in Missouri. And all of a sudden, I owned a cremation service. Not too long after that, my wife, who was a nurse practitioner, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. And she obviously, first thing she said was, I should not be prescribing drugs to people. So she retired herself, and she said, while I'm still me, I want to be around the kids and grandkids, and they were all back here in St. Louis. So mm-hmm. I sold the funeral home and moved back with her here to St. Louis. Right.
And we were chatting a little bit before this, and I said, oh, did you work for the Neptune Society then? And your response was?
No, in California, I was their main competitor. And so when I moved here to St. Louis, they asked if I would run their St. Louis region.
Wonderful. And that's where Dan and I connected. And I have learned so much listening to him that I just asked him and said, can you please be on my podcast? My people need to know what you know. So whenever I'm doing a podcast interview, I always ask my guests to share with me 3 questions that will help my listeners become educated on what they need to know that they don't know. So question number 1, Dan, is what are some things that people have always believed about funerals that really aren't true?
Well, one of the things that has not changed in 150 years is the way we handle our dead. Prior to 1918, prior to the Spanish influenza epidemic, we took care of our own dead. Grandma would die at home. The women folk would bathe her, dress her, do her hair. The men folk would go out to the barn and build her a coffin. We would invite the community into our home to have a funeral. And then we would put her coffin on the back of the wagon and everybody would follow it to the cemetery. But when the Spanish influenza epidemic happened, all of a sudden, every other member of your family was dropping dead.
Yes,
and it was just overwhelming. Mm-hmm. So that's where the modern funeral industry started. And just like any business, they're in the business to make money. So over the years, over the last however many generations since 1918, we have kind of been fed this, for lack of a better term, I'll call it propaganda, of things that really just aren't true. And if we're told it long enough, you just think it's the truth. Perfect example, embalming, the process of draining all the blood out of the body, filling the body with a very carcinogenic liquid to quote unquote preserve the body. Funeral homes used to tell people that was required by law. And finally, the federal government actually had to step in and make it a federal offense to tell people that embalming is not required. Now, it's not required by law.
Okay.
You can go to the funeral home that you're going to use, and they have the right to say, well, if you're going to have a viewing in our funeral home, we require embalming. Okay. But the problem that you run into, I know some funeral homes here in St. Louis that don't even have refrigeration facilities. And by law, when the body is in the possession of a funeral director, it either has to be embalmed or refrigerated within 24 hours. These funeral homes don't even have refrigeration facilities, not because they can't afford them, but because that forces you to have your loved one embalmed, and they get to charge you an additional $600, $900, whatever dollars in order to do that. So that's kind of I worry about the ethics of that. Let's put it that way. But embalming is not required anywhere by law, and don't let anybody tell you that it is.
Thanks for clearing that up for us. I think that's really a good tip and something we wouldn't know, which is why you're here. So thank you.
Yeah, another one is caskets. There's nothing that says that you're required to buy a casket or a vault. There's no law that requires that. As a matter of fact, there's a resurgence in what's called green burials, which is the way we used to bury people, in a simple wooden box or just wrapped in a shroud so that your body goes back to the earth, which it can't do in a metal casket that's inside of a concrete or metal vault. But again, the cemetery, because they own their own property, they have the right to say, if you want to be buried in our cemetery, we require a casket or we require a vault. Let's keep in mind that the funeral industry, the traditional funeral industry, doesn't make its money taking care of your loved one. They make their money selling you things: caskets, vaults, headstones, limousines, flowers, chapel rentals. That's how they make money.
Yes.
So, and as such, here in the St. Louis region, there is only one cemetery in the entire region that even allows green burials. And of course, that's our famous Bellefontaine Cemetery that's been around since 1849. They have now dedicated an entire section to green burials.
Amazing.
But other cemeteries will not allow it because they don't make any money off of you. Okay. And a lot of people don't even get what vaults are for. Do you know what a vault is for?
I know that it's, my parents were buried at a national cemetery, so that was part. So that's what the casket goes in.
Right. So we've all seen, when we look in the hole, there's this great big concrete box or metal box that's already in there before the casket goes in.
Yes.
That serves one purpose and one purpose only. It keeps the ground from settling so they can cut the grass easier. That's the only purpose it serves. So you're going to, in a private cemetery, you're going to pay anywhere from $3,500 to $5,000 for that vault just so they can cut the grass easier. The same holds true if you see a cemetery that only allows flat markers. That's solely so they can cut the grass.
Right. But
you're paying for it. The other thing that I think people would find interesting is you don't even have to hire a funeral home. There is no law that says you have to hire a funeral home. Another movement that is coming back, I kind of alluded to this prior to 1918, they're bringing back the concept of home funerals, where grandma dies at home, you take care of her at home, the services are there in the home. And so there's now the National Home Funeral Alliance, that is an organization that is trying to get people to bring that back. And it's gaining in popularity in places like Southern California and the Northwest. Now, I will tell you this, while you're not required to hire a funeral home, it would make your life a lot easier if you just went in and hired them just to do the paperwork.
Yes.
Because doing the paperwork that's required to generate the death certificate and things like that can be very cumbersome.
Yes.
Unless you're authorized to use the state death reporting system. But you can hire the funeral home just to do the paperwork, and you do all the rest.
Yes, yes. When my mother passed, I had made an arrangement because she had lived to 100. I had made an arrangement that at that age, how many living friends would she have left? And so it was very simple and straightforward. And I was so thankful for the information, because when you have information like this, you can decide then what makes sense in your world. And so we did not have a big service. The Veterans Cemetery allowed for a 15-minute service, and it was great. It was no stress, no strain on me. And like you said, they did the paperwork and they did the transportation and things like that. So, if we don't get information like this, we just continue to march in one direction. And then some of those expenses can be very daunting.
Well, and I think a big part of that is people just don't know that they have rights.
Correct.
You don't have to buy anything.
Mm-hmm.
The funeral home's going to try and sell you register books and prayer cards and flowers and chapel rental. You don't have to have any of that.
Yes.
And you have the right to say, I want this, but I don't want this. I want this, but I don't need that. Mm-hmm. And you have that right. And I think nobody's ever told us that we have these kind of rights. And what happens is you've lost your loved one. You're in a state of confusion and grieving. You are now put into a major financial decision-making process.
Correct.
That could cost somewhere around $20,000. And you're going into it blind.
Yes.
You wouldn't go into that situation to buy a car. You wouldn't go into that situation to buy a house blind. But we do this all the time with our loved ones. And it's not something that people do every day. So they basically just give themselves over to the funeral home. Mm-hmm. And the funeral home just says, here you go. You need this, you need this, you need this, you need this. And by the time they're done with you, you've spent $20,000 and have no idea why.
Yes, absolutely. So we understand that. Let's talk, and I know we're going to get to our last question, which will help us to not put ourselves in that state. But let's talk about what you just mentioned, and that was home funerals.
Okay.
What's meant by that term, home funerals?
Well, home funeral didn't used to have a title because that's just what funerals were prior to the Spanish influenza epidemic. But now it's meant that, let's say that you've cared for your loved one at home or even at a facility. Mm-hmm. You can have the funeral home pick mom up at the nursing home mm-hmm. and bring her to your home.
Oh, wow.
Rather than the funeral home. Mm-hmm. We would come in and we would help you care for the body. Mm-hmm. We would help you bathe the body. We would bring in ice blankets. One of the problems that we have in our society right now, we're in such a zombie society with zombie movies and zombie we have it in our mind that the instant somebody dies, they just start to decay right before your eyes. And it's just not true. For the most part, for the first 5 days or so, you just look like you're asleep. As a matter of fact, in the Buddhist tradition, they're not allowed to move the body for the first 3 days.
Wow.
So here's mom. She's in bed at home or on the couch at home. We have put ice blankets above her and below her, and you pull the quilt up over it so you don't see the blankets. And it looks like she's just lying there in bed. And then you invite family and friends in for the service. And then you might have the funeral home come in and actually take her to either the crematory or the cemetery, just mm-hmm. because they've got a hearse and you don't.
Right.
But again, you don't need to. You can put her in the back of the station wagon if you want to and take her to the crematory or the cemetery. But the most important part of this is we have evolved from those days prior to the Spanish influenza epidemic to what we have now, which is mom dies at home in the middle of the night. Guys in black suits come in. They zip her up in a plastic bag and whisk her away. and you never see her again. Or if you do, she's now in a casket with clown makeup on, looking nothing like she ever looked in life. Mm-hmm. And that's it. And here's the problem. Here's the real problem. They have taken away the family's ability to have closure in this death. If you think about it, the way it used to be, as I mentioned, the women folk bathe her and dress her and do her hair. The men folk build her coffin, things like that. And the one group we haven't really mentioned are the children.
Right.
And this is the biggest problem. Here's what we've done to our children in modern society. We do one of two things when mom dies. We either keep them completely away. We don't even let them go to the funeral because we figure they can't handle it. Mm-hmm. And then we have to somehow explain why grandma's no longer around. Mm-hmm. Or they do what somebody did to my daughter when my mother died, and that's drag her into the chapel, drag her to the front of the room, kicking and screaming, grab her arm and make her physically touch the dead body. No trauma there. But now imagine, let me reset the scene. When nobody would cringe if I said a home birth. Mm-hmm. Oh, she's decided to give birth at home. All right. So the woman's lying in bed. She's got the midwife there, and they've even gathered the children around to watch the birth. Nobody would think that's creepy. But if I were to change that from birth to death, okay, kids, gather around the bed. Grandma's getting ready to go. Mm-hmm. And let's all gather around and be with grandma. And the kids are right there holding grandma's hand as she dies. Mm-hmm. And then the children help prepare her for her funeral and things like that. They're now involved with the death. It's no longer this taboo thing. That's why we're all so scared of death, is because everybody who's alive now has been through that process of being kept away from it as children. Mm-hmm. We need to bring that back to involve the children in death. Have them holding grandma's hand as she dies. Don't scoot them out of the room. Mm-hmm. They need to see that. They need to see her final moments. And they need to be part of that process of preparing the body through the entire thing. That way they have an understanding. We're not afraid of things we know about. Yeah, we're afraid of things we've been kept from.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. And obviously, your wife, Marcia, did a beautiful service for her patients by providing hospice care as a nurse, and certainly was part of those home deaths and being involved in all of that. But it is hard to plan something and to figure out what you're going to do when you don't really understand it. And because we've never seen a funeral like that in recent history, we're just not that familiar with it. So it's fun to hear the changes that are happening and going on, not only within your industry or your service, but also within families and what they want to do.
Well, what's interesting is that you say, you refer to it as changes going on in the industry. It's actually not changes. People have always said to me, well, how long have home funerals been legal? Mm-hmm. Always. They've never not been legal.
Interesting.
As a matter of fact, when I was in California, we used to do full body burials at sea. Uh-huh. Like in the pirate movies where the guy's on the board under the flag and you tip it up and the body goes into the ocean. And people look at me and say, is that legal? Well, yeah. How long has it been legal? Always. It's never not been legal. Home funerals have never not been legal. It's just that we have been told for so long that, only a funeral professional should touch a dead body. You have to do this. You have to do that. That we have forgotten all of this stuff has always been legal and it used to be the norm. Mm-hmm. So, and that's what I'm hoping anyway, that it comes back to. It's just that people have never been told what their rights are in this situation that they're not used to.
Yeah. And Dan is a great educator in this. And that's why we connected and got together and why I wanted to have him on this podcast. Now, pre-planning. there are some advantages to pre-planning, and I think all the information that you have given us thus far will kind of help us to be able to be ready to spend some time in this space. So what are some of the advantages to pre-planning, and can you give an example from your
Sure.
years of experience in this industry?
Well, let's define pre-planning. Officially, legally, it's called a pre-need plan. And what it basically means is you can pre-arrange for your own funeral and prepay for it. Okay? And there are several reasons you want to do this. There's several big advantages. Number one, you get to tell people what your wishes are. I can't tell you how often I have to sit there with the surviving adult children and they say, well, we just have no idea what mom wanted. We never talked to her about it. And one of two things happens. Either mom doesn't want to talk about her own death, or the kids don't want to talk to mom about her death. But then what happens are the surviving children go through this horrible angst of, we have no idea what he wanted. We had no idea what she wanted. We never spoke about it. And they just feel so guilt-ridden about the fact that they never did it. We thought we had more time. So, but you get to say what your wishes are. If you want your ashes spread over the Himalayas, nobody can come in and say, well, I don't care what she wanted. I want her buried, not cremated. I want this to happen and this to happen. And we say, nope, sorry, right here in her own hand, she wrote this, and it's completely incontestable in court. It is a locked-in contract. So you get to decide. As we like to say, you wouldn't let your kids plan your vacation. Why would you let them plan this? So another big thing is, and this is probably of paramount importance to most people, is it locks in today's price. I am cremating. I cremated a woman the other day for $300 because she bought a contract from us like 35 years ago, and that's what it cost back then. We're not allowed to raise that price. I have to cremate her for $300 because that's what we contracted to do.
So the Neptune Society et al., so all of your members,
Brands, yeah.
yes, would be under that same contract,
Yes.
Dan? Because I know myself, pre-planning contracts can have a clause in there for inflation. So
Right.
you might, even though you had an agreement, so that's something that you would really need to check out.
Right. Not only does ours not have that clause for inflation, but because we're all over the country, let's say that you bought your pre-need plan here in Missouri and you decided to retire to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Well, when you pass, our Albuquerque office will take care of you, just as if they had written the contract.
So then our listeners could go to www.neptunesociety.com.
NeptuneSociety.com. Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, that's good. And then they can find a local service in there. So any more information about pre-planning?
Well, and of course, the other thing that it does, and again, this is real big for people, is you're prepaying. Now, whether you put the entire amount down or you open it with $100 and pay $50 a month till it's paid off, the bottom line is you're not sticking your kids with the bill. And I tell you, I have this happen a lot with veterans, where a Vietnam era veteran will pass. I'm in the arrangement room with the widow, and she says, well, he told me the VA paid for all this. I don't have any money. He said it was all taken care of. And I have to tell her, ma'am, the VA doesn't pay for funeral arrangements. He gets a flag. And if you want him interred at Jefferson Barracks, they pay for that. But they don't pay for the cremation or the casket or whatever. The funeral arrangements are all still up to you. The same with the kids. So mom has died, and now the kids have to cough up however much money.
Right.
And a lot of people say, well, I don't want my kids to have to pay for this. I want to prepay it. The other thing that is important to know about pre-needs is if you are involved with trying to qualify for Medicaid,
Yes.
it counts towards what's called Medicaid spend down.
Correct.
So you've killed two birds with one stone. You've gotten rid of those assets to help qualify for Medicaid, and you have prepaid for the funeral that is inevitable that's going to happen.
Right. So you can have $100,000 funeral if you want. And when you do your Medicaid pre-planning, I'm just joking. It wouldn't be that much, but I have heard people doing that, spending quite a bit of money and so that they can pre-plan. Right, so, but yes, that's a very important point.
And while we're talking about those kind of laws, I want to put this in very quickly. Laws are constantly changing in states, and Missouri just had several laws change this last August. When we talk about survivors, there were two very interesting changes. Number one, when you pass, if you do not have a spouse, your children are your next of kin and have the legal right to make your arrangements, that sort of thing. They just changed the law to say that minor children are now qualify. It used to be adult children.
Oh, wow.
But now if you have a 16-year-old son and he's your only child, he can now, through his guardian, obviously they're not going to have a 5-year-old make funeral arrangements, but through their guardian, they can make your funeral arrangements. But here's one that's even stranger that your folks need to know. Let's say that you and I are married, okay? And we file for divorce.
Yes.
And then I drop dead. You and I are no longer married. We didn't go to court yet. The divorce hasn't been granted. We just filed for divorce. But just by filing for divorce, you are no longer my spouse and have no rights to make my funeral arrangements.
So then that would revert back to any living children.
We would have to go to whoever is the next in line, be it children or whomever. There's a very distinct line of what we call the line of succession. First it's you, then it's a power of attorney, then it's a spouse, then it's children, then it's parents, and it just keeps going.
And then just to complicate that, you had shared with me that in the state of Missouri, your healthcare agent has no authority to make your funeral arrangements. So if I would be my mother's power of attorney, that relationship stopped there. Unless the health care directive that we prepared would have stated that my agent has the right to control the disposition of my remains after my death.
Correct. So in some states like California, if I were your healthcare agent, it's implied that I have the right to control, make your funeral arrangements and things like that. What we call controlling the disposition of your remains after your death. But in Missouri, they have passed a law just in the last couple of years stating that it has to be explicitly written as one of the agent's powers. So in the second part of any healthcare directive, it says powers of the agent. And it'll say things like, you have the power to take me off a respirator. You have the power to fire my physician. You have the power to put me in a different facility. And then towards the end, it needs to say something along the lines of, my agent has the right to control the disposition of my remains after my death. That way it's explicitly written as one of the powers. If that's not in there in some verbiage or another, your attorney might decide to use slightly different verbiage. But this is called the right of sepulture is the legal term. And if it's not expressly written in your healthcare power of attorney, as you mentioned, the power of attorney expires when the person does. Yeah.
So this is all interesting and needed information, and I hope you've been listening carefully to this. And of course, Dan and his other managing directors of these cremation services, and you don't have to choose cremation. You can choose something else. This is all about choice and knowledge and wisdom and making decisions that make sense for you. But you certainly helped me to kind of bring this back to the forefront and to really start thinking about what Gary and I would like to make as we move forward. And then once that's done, you always feel so much freedom, don't you?
Absolutely.
You get this, boy, this is done. And then I don't have to think about this again. What if I did make an arrangement and then I changed my mind? What about that?
Well, one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning of the show was that you and your husband review this on a regular basis.
Right.
And people need to realize that these sorts of arrangements, living wills and healthcare directives and things like that, are living documents. They are dynamic. They have to be reviewed on a regular basis. People tell me all the time, oh, we've had our healthcare directive. We've had that done for 20 years. Well, guess what? If you had it done for 20 years, you don't have the right of sepulture in there. I guarantee it. Right. So it needs to be reviewed on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So
even during COVID, I had said, we had made an arrangement that we didn't want feeding tubes, but I said that was pre-COVID. And I said, please don't be so stringent when you go to my wishes. Please find out more information. Like, will I come back from this? Will I heal from this before you pull that feeding tube? So I know we're making light of what is inevitable. And these are conversations that we need to have and find some comfort level in. So I know you've done that for us today. Dan, the people that listen to my podcast, they might be in crisis with their health care. Okay. Or a loved one that's going through a healthcare crisis. They could be looking at this and saying, hey, this is something we really need to take care of as we start to think about aging in place and what we need to know. But at the end of every podcast, I know the challenges of being a caregiver for a loved one. And so I like to encourage people who are listening who also may be caregivers. And I know that you're a caregiver. So what might you share for my listeners today from your own playbook?
Well, something that I found out just recently, unfortunately, my wife fell and hit her head on the floor and required stitches and an elevated level of care. And because the caregiver industry, if you will, is such a tight-knit group, everybody's great about referring other people to other people. And so I went to her daycare center, and they were able to refer me to a placement person who found respite care. And for being a caregiver, I didn't understand what respite care meant.
Right.
I only knew respite care to mean, hey, there's a place here, the Caregivers Club here in St. Louis. Perfect example.
Yes.
They will send somebody over to watch your loved one for an afternoon so you can have a break. Mm-hmm. So I thought that's what respite care was. I didn't realize until my wife's accident that there were places where she could go and stay to recover. And the wonderful lady that found this for me found a place that would take her for 2 weeks. So it's a full service nursing home, if you will. And but she could just be there for 2 weeks while she recovered.
Right.
And they call that respite care. And so that was a brand new thing for me. So it redefined respite care as not just for an afternoon, but what if the caregiver needs to go out of town for a few days or wants to go out of town for a few days? So I would encourage people to use this wonderful network we have in town. If you know one person in caregiving, I guarantee you now know everybody in caregiving.
He's right about that.
And then, respite.
Networking makes a difference in people's lives. And I would also say that not being quiet about your caregiving role and allowing other people that you've come to know and say, this is the role I'm in. Do you know somebody I should be talking to about this? And I guarantee you, there's even a marketing group that's I know a guy or I know a gal. And so you're going to get more information. And really, Dan, this is why I started the podcast, is so that we aren't so stuck because nobody likes to be stuck.
Well, one of the things that's similar in your industry and my industry is by the time you need it, you don't know anything about it. Mm-hmm. This is the first time I've ever had to arrange a funeral. This is the first time I've ever had to be a caregiver. And nobody trains you for this kind of stuff. And you are really at the mercy of people who know what they're talking about. I don't mean that in a bad way.
No.
But let's hope you find somebody like you, and I'd like to think like me, that are concerned about making sure that this journey is as easy for you as possible and not taking advantage of the situation.
Right. We're going to end on a humorous note here because this has been kind of heavy for you today. But Dan, one more time with your great line that I love that you say.
Remember, folks, talking about sex doesn't make you pregnant, and talking about funerals doesn't make you dead.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, listeners, for sticking with us today. I hope this has been valuable for you as you think through what you want your last wishes to be. Join me again next time on Aging in Place, Strategies and Answers.